Hello, everyone, and welcome to MMA Start to Finish. I'm Julian, and this is Matt.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about UFC 11.5, the Ultimate 1996, the second tournament they held at the end of the year, where they got all the best fighters and put them in one super tournament. Given that the last tournament they held basically fell apart,
Yeah.
they were a little more nervous this time, so they took one precaution I noticed. They have 3 alternates instead of 2,
Yeah.
which, is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound as far as the whole tournament problem goes, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, guys, I see guys are having problem fighting multiple times in a night. What if we had more people fight multiple times in a night? Surely that will solve the problem.
It kind of worked again, but it's a problem that this isn't the proper way to fix it.
I mean, you're really just playing Russian roulette every event, hoping things don't fall apart. Oh, by the way, as you'll note from our first slide here, parental discretion is advised. The first event we've seen from the UFC where we actually have a Tipper Gore-esque advisory before the event.
It only took 11 events and 2 special events.
And legal pressure.
Yeah.
A lot of legal pressure. But I will note, with that legal pressure in mind and declining buy rates and every single provider except for very few dropping the UFC, we actually did see an increase in buy rate. What was the increase again, Matt?
28,000.
Went from 92,000 to 120,000. I would imagine that a lot of the reason this sold so well is because it was like the ultimate and they had all their guys showing up.
Yeah.
And on the poster here, he didn't fight, but we can see them marketing Mark Coleman, who we find out was unable to compete at all tonight due to a virus.
They didn't really say what virus it was, just he's sick. A little disappointing, but, it happens. I think they got some better cameras this time, too.
We have been debating that. I can't quite find anything in the Wikipedia here, but Matt did mention why would they put improved cameras in the Wikipedia. That's a rather tedious detail for them to keep in the Wikipedia. But maybe they improved camera technology since July.
I don't know if they just improved camera technology. I think they just decided to up the production value.
Perhaps. With that production value in mind, still can't afford a real venue. No disrespect to the fairgrounds of Birmingham, Alabama. And we are back in Birmingham, Alabama. I believe for the second time in the history of the UFC. We return to one of the only states that welcome sub-legal things. Fucking Alabama. So, we have here again the laws of the Octagon. Most of the rules remain the same. There is one glaring omission here on the laws of the Octagon that we'll get to later. But we see they've once again screwed with the time limits. Now, at this point, I'm too exhausted to check at what they were in the last event because they're so flippant with them. So we'll just lay out what we have here. 12 minutes in the quarters and semis with a 3-minute overtime, and 15 minutes in the final with 2 3-minute overtimes. How do you feel about them constantly just fucking with us when it comes to the time limits and not making their mind up?
At this point, I feel like the fighters are just fighting until someone stops them, Yeah,
the time limits, I don't want to say they're irrelevant, but when you take or add 3 minutes, when you're not even breaking these fights up into rounds, it doesn't really matter, if I'm going to be honest with you.
Yeah. A minute or 2 more, or a minute or 2 less, or I think at one point we had 20-minute rounds, and even earlier it was unlimited. Just finish it.
It's been all over the place, man, and I'm not sure when they eventually do get a consistent time to stick with, but I eagerly await that date for our sake.
So far, we still haven't even reached. I mean, we have, but with this time limit, we won't even reach the 25 minutes that we see nowadays.
It's true. This is actually, for championship fights.
Yeah.
It's shorter than championship fights. That's still true. With that time limit in mind, though, I actually don't believe we see any of these fights go to decision. I'm pretty sure all of these fights are finished. So here is the main draw for the Tournament of Champions. Ken Shamrock against Brian Johnston. Big Daddy Gary Goodridge against Don Frye. The rematch from their brawl in Puerto Rico. Tank Abbott taking on Cal Worsham. Now, my intuition is that Cal was originally supposed to be Mark Coleman, because out of the Tournament of Champions, no disrespect to Cal Worsham, but as our good friends from Sesame Street say, one of these things is not like the other.
Yeah.
One of these things is not like the other thing.
He doesn't have the same
Gravitas.
Yeah. He's not as popular with everyone.
That's really all it is. I mean, no disrespect to Cal, but foreshadowing, Tank disrespected him a lot more than I ever could.
Yeah.
So for our first fight of the night, we have Ken Shamrock taking on the AKA product Brian Johnston. Ken actually deciding for the first time in his short MMA career that it would behoove him to wear gloves.
Yeah.
And wore gloves out to this fight.
He's noticed that other people wear gloves and they can hit more and harder.
And usually in a safer manner, but as we find out later, not always the case.
Yeah. I noticed when they were announcing this fight, and this is for all the fights, they have a weird font choice.
Oh, and speaking of announcing, we do have a new announcer for UFC 11.5. Manny Garcia. And Manny, I gotta say, seems like he's announced some shit before. Pretty good. Pretty good at this job.
He hyped up the crowd a lot better than...
the G-Man.
Yeah, the G-Man. But the font was weird this time. They have it like... the first name, nothing's capitalized. The last name, all capitalized.
Yeah, there was some weird production stuff, and normally I just chalk that up to like, oh, it's the 90s, some production stuff's going to be kind of weird. But this seemed like even, I don't want to say even more low budget than usual, but like they hired somebody new and they weren't exactly well-versed in graphic design. One thing I did notice before this fight even started is that it seemed like Brian was actually a lot bigger than Ken, and not necessarily in terms of weight, but I believe Ken was 6 foot and Brian was like 6'4".
Yeah. Brian just also has, I think, longer limbs.
Lankier for sure.
Yeah.
And also a better grasp of those limbs being a kickboxer.
Yeah. He's just larger. Even with Ken's V-shaped body.
Brian really didn't get a chance to use those long legs of his, though, because almost immediately Ken took him down to the ground and started unloading with some ground and pound that we hadn't seen before, taking it to Brian and using the fence to hold him into place while he threw those punches, where shortly after we would hear Big John say, "Let go of the fence."
Yeah.
Now we're here scratching our heads because at this point in time, if you haven't listened to our shows before, in the year 1996, grabbing the fence was completely legal. We saw Tank Abbott do it quite a bit.
It was his, like, signature thing to do.
Signature move, in fact, I'd say. But here, we now hear the commentary note that one of the new rules for this event is that you can't grab the cage.
You can't grab the Ken.
You can't grab. First of all, you can't grab the Ken. Second of all, you can't grab the cage a lot. A little bit, maybe. They were vague about it. They weren't even clear. They didn't even make a real decision. They were like, you can't hold onto the cage for that long.
Yeah.
There's no unit of time there.
We had an angle from outside of the octagon where Ken was holding onto the fence to get more leverage to punch Brian in the face.
I think John just didn't see it for a while. I think that's what happened.
Probably. And so with that, and then we're hearing the commentators talk about how there's this new rule of you can't hold onto the fence for too long. So we're thinking maybe it's like there's a 5-second rule or something.
Also, by the way, if you're going to go through the effort to create a new graphic for the rules, maybe add the new rule to the graphic. Just a suggestion.
The rule that affects a lot of how people fight.
Yeah, it's not like, oh, you can't wear green trunks anymore. It's, no, you can't grab the cage that you fight in. A big deal.
A lot of this fight stays with this picture.
Yeah, this is basically the story of the fight. If you're following along here on YouTube, it's a picture of Ken from a very open guard of Brian, just sort of wailing away. And
slowly turning him into a cauliflower.
Yeah, it wasn't one big shot, really, that got Brian to eventually submit to strikes, but after wearing him down, I have that he tapped to exhaustion, excuse me. What does it have for on Wikipedia as the method of finish here? Submission forearm choke. I don't agree with that. I don't think it was a forearm choke. I think he was just tired.
Yeah. Brian, I don't think he was really known for his longevity.
I don't think he was really known for his grappling. He did come from, the American Kickboxing Academy, which would, eventually go on to produce skilled grapplers and strikers and well-rounded fighters. But in '96, I imagine, primarily focused on kickboxing.
I mean, his legs are kicking in this.
For his life.
A note on our last podcast, we mentioned that we had this debate going on about why Brian was so angry or passionate about
Animated.
about his win against
I think it was Reza, the guy from Iran.
yeah. If not, sorry. But Big John got in between them, stopped the fight, and he just seemed very, as you said, animated about it. Turns out Big John did mess up Brian's nose, and that's why he was mad.
Yeah, when he jumped in to separate them to end the fight, apparently, I don't know if it was with his shoulder, with his arm, I don't know if it was what, but he caught Brian in the nose and broke his fucking nose.
Yeah.
During a night where there are tournaments, sir, and he has to fight again.
Yeah. So
That's why he was pissed.
Yeah. So now we know.
Setting the record straight, if you will.
Yeah.
Up next, it's time for the rematch of UFC Puerto Rico. Don Frye, the Predator, against Big Daddy Gary Goodridge. And this clinch photograph you see here on the YouTube version of the podcast basically breaks down the entire story of the fight. Most of this fight was this position where they clinched and they struck. And I will say both Don and Gary got a lot of good strikes through, but Don had the better of them.
Yeah. Don knew when to change levels, I think, better.
Yeah, Don knew when to go to the body, when to go to the head, when to throw an uppercut, when to throw a hook. Gary certainly had a lot of power behind his shots, but wasn't picking them as well.
Yeah.
Also, I will note that Gary pretty much stuck with punches, while Don was mixing it up with knees and uppercuts and eventually elbows too.
Gary brought in his gi, as you can see, again, but I don't know if it really helped him.
I think it actually worked against him because Don was holding on to that to keep him in place while he was throwing a lot of those strikes. Also, on an entire note, Don, no shoes this time, so he was able to actually get some kicks in there if he chose to do so.
Indeed. I feel like Gary might be wearing his gi because that's just what he's used to training in.
That's probably it, and that's also what he's had his most success, in, with that spectacular knockout where he took that guy down and sent him to a different galaxy.
You mean the crucifix?
Yeah, the crucifix knockout with the elbows.
I love that fight.
If you know who Gary Goodridge is, you're familiar with that knockout.
Yeah.
Also, at this point in the night, right before this fight started, we would find out that even though he wore gloves, Ken broke his hand.
Yep.
Somehow beating the shit out of Brian, shattered one of his hands. And this would actually be the last we see of Ken for the next 6 years. Ken would not return, as we find out on the Wikipedia entry, to the UFC until 2002 at UFC 40. So, goodbye, Ken. Enjoy your time in the WWF fighting The Rock and The Undertaker. And Stone Cold Steve Austin.
So it's The Rock versus The Rock.
Yeah, that is funny, isn't it? His nickname was The Rock before, Dwayne stepped onto the scene.
Before the fight, they were talking about how Gary Goodridge had been favoring power over technique. I think he mostly just did weights before this.
I mean, at this point, I'm a big fan of Gary's, but you gotta start taking both the cardio and the technique a little more seriously. He clearly has the tools, but really, to be fair to him, it's not like there's a lot of people out there teaching this right now. Where is he really going to go outside of, his enemies, Don Frye, Dan Severn, to train him?
He did say he was recently training for more ground game, but this never goes to the ground.
Well, it does go to the ground. Gary did take him down, but it didn't exactly end the way Gary would have liked.
True.
So yeah, after this clinch exchange, Gary winds up taking down Don, not with a double leg, but he pulled him towards his chest and swept out the leg from under him. And I would say got some decently effective strikes out of that position, but Don was actually the more threatening from there as he threatened with an armbar like 3 or 4 times. I believe what you have in your notes.
Yeah. Armbar. Nope. Armbar. Nope.
Armbar.
Nope.
Armbar.
No.
But no armbar. So yeah, the finish here is very weird. So Gary is on top, but Don advances into a sprawl position, and from there, Gary winds up on his back and Gary, who, as we've come to learn, is a very tired man once you get about 6 minutes into a fight. Again, I have here taps from exhaustion. We'll see what they have here on Wikipedia as the method of submission. Fatigue. Yeah, that's accurate. That's basically what he submitted to.
After 11 minutes and 19 seconds.
This was the longest fight of the night.
Yeah. So I'm someone who likes these little tidbits of information that you probably wouldn't get just hearing about the event. But at one point, the camera just goes away from the fight at, I think, Don's wife, maybe?
It was his strength and conditioning coach.
Okay.
At a critical juncture in the fight, when they were in the middle of clinch work, they decided, let's get a shot of his coach.
Yeah.
And they just snapped out of there and showed us his coach in her fucking Superman t-shirt. And when they came back...
They were out of the clinch.
Yeah, we missed an actual transition in the fight because of 90s camera work.
Yeah. Also, during their time on the ground, we got to see Don Frye's lime green leopard print underwear.
Don Frye, not only a man of the people, but a man of the ladies as well.
Yes.
Up next, we have Tank Abbott against Cal Worsham. And before I show you the next picture we have lined up for you, I'd like to encourage any audio-only listeners we have to join us on YouTube, if just not for this fight, because we have probably my favorite screenshot we've taken from any of the events. Tank decided this was his octagon. Cal did not belong in his octagon, decided to lift him up like a toddler, and proceed to deposit him like garbage over the top. Or at least he tried to. He didn't actually chuck him over the top, just to be clear.
He got the closest to throwing someone out of the ring I've ever seen.
So the way this fight started, it did not start with Cal in midair.
No.
Tank and Cal approached each other both through, I don't want to say sloppy strikes, but, kind of wild, flailing shots. Not a lot of technique behind them, but certainly a lot of power. And eventually, Tank would grab a hold of Cal and elevate him.
Mm-hmm. I also have some notes from before the fight. So, they were going into the background of each of our fighters, even though we're familiar with each of them.
No new faces this time around, we should note. At all. Everybody here except one of the alternates who we are exposed to later are all familiar fighters for us.
Yeah. Tank dropped 25 pounds. He's getting a little healthier. So that's nice. We learned that Cal likes to hunt things like deers, turkeys, and tanks. He was a Marine for, I think they said 4 years, and he was in the Army for 3. I'm sorry, Cal, if I got these wrong.
So Cal, a man of discipline, his opponent, not so much.
Yeah. Tank, he has many years in the streets.
Seasoned street fighter, I believe.
Yeah.
They called him.
And there was even a poster saying, Tank keeps hospitals busy.
That's right. I forgot about that sign. That was quite the sign to display when you're working on the image of your sport.
Yeah. Tank, he always has such great quotes before these. He said, if he wasn't here, he'd be getting in a bar fight.
Tank Abbott, ladies and gentlemen.
A man of the people.
A man of the mob, for sure.
Yeah. He's the one starting the mob.
So, this fight, after Tank tried to eject Cal from the octagon, went to the ground. Tank would proceed with some strikes from the guard. There was, I hesitate to use the word grappling because neither of them really looked like they knew what they were doing, to be honest with you. They kind of just played in Cal's guard for a little while before Tank would unload on him a little bit. And, there's a little bit of a controversy here at the end of this fight. So, Cal taps on the mat. Nowadays, you don't see people tap on the mat anymore. There's a reason for that. Because your opponent doesn't really know you tapped if you're tapping on the mat. There's a reason people tap on their opponent. It's to get them to stop doing whatever they're doing. So, with that in mind, Cal taps on the mat, and Big John runs in, and it looks like as he runs in, there's a shot that kind of coincides with Big John running in, and that looks copacetic. But we see our friend Cal begin to absolutely lose his shit to the point where Big John has to restrain him up against the cage. At this point, me and Matt are very confused.
What's going on? Why is Big John grabbing the fence?
Why is Cal saying he wants him disqualified?
Yeah. So, initially we thought Cal was mad because Big John stopped the fight at the same time as Tank punching him, which we're thinking, that's a
Borderline.
yeah, but it happens. Like, he was already wound up and throwing a punch. It's just gonna happen sometimes. Turns out,
Yeah, looking at the replay, we would find out that well after John had stepped in, while Tank was still kind of on top of him, I don't know if I'd call it exactly a punch, but it was certainly like a forearm or like a top of the hand shiver to the face. Like, he like pushed him with his hand while he was getting off of him.
Yeah.
In like an aggressive way. And turns out that's what Cal was fucking pissed about. He was storming at him. Big John had to pull him up against the cage. He was saying he wanted Tank disqualified. Big John basically was like, yeah, that's not my authority.
Yeah.
I'll bring it up, but, you know, that doesn't... Spoiler, Tank does not get disqualified for some slightly unbecoming behavior. You know. It's going to take a little more than that in the 90s. They're a little short on big names.
Yeah. I was actually saying while we were watching this, nowadays, if someone had done that, that would be a huge thing and people would be booing.
That'd be a way bigger of a deal,
Yeah. But back here, there's well, they advertise it as there are no rules. There's a few rules. But the crowd doesn't want there to be rules. So
yeah, the crowd's not exactly concerned with civility.
yeah, they just want to see people fuck each other up.
They just want blood, dude, if we're going to be real. They're in fucking Alabama.
Yeah.
No disrespect to any Alabamans listening to the podcast.
Yeah. It's just, Cal, you might be a man of honor, but Tank is not, and the people watching don't really care for your honor right now. Polar Bear versus Jesus, who will win?
That's right. Up next, we have the return of the polar bear, Paul Varlins, taking on the man of the cross, Chemo. He's back, and he's on his ketogenic diet. He's looking lean, he's looking mean, he's looking cut, and he's got a new back piece.
Two things. I thought you were going to say Jesus is back, which would have been great. And would it be a ketogenic or chemogenic?
You see, you found the joke there.
Yeah.
It was there somewhere.
Yeah.
So, Chemo's back, and he's actually, like we said, he's trim. He's not only shed the weight of his former felon manager, but he's also shed some of that bulk. A much leaner man, better cardio, and he's apparently also been training in some jiu-jitsu, which is very impressive, honestly. After losing to Hoist Gracie all those years ago, he decided to take up the art of his enemy.
Yeah. He actually dropped 40 pounds.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like Chemo was some overweight dude. He was already, like, just a big, jacked dude before.
Yeah. It took me like a year to lose 50 pounds. So, props to Chemo. Meanwhile, Paul gained weight.
Yeah, Paul's somehow puffier.
He is, the commentator said, at least 340 pounds.
He would have to cut 80 pounds to fight in the UFC today. That's insane. To make the upper limit of the uppermost weight class in 2019, Paul would have to cut 80 pounds. That's crazy. We could not have a Paul Varlins today.
You'd have to, like, birth a first grader.
So, you may have asked yourself, where's Paul been? We have not seen him in some time. Since we last saw Paul, he's actually been fighting in some other MMA promotions in both Kiev and Japan. So Paul honing his skills overseas before returning to the UFC.
However, he's not quite as well trained as he could be.
Yeah, even though he is about 3 times the size of Chemo here, he can't really use that to his advantage. So the fight starts out with Chemo shooting for a single leg, and it's not really going to work. It's like trying to tackle a tree. It's not very effective. I mean, you can try. Paul would kind of collapse around him and start to throw some elbows, but didn't really capitalize on him as much as he could, you were saying.
Yeah, there was a lot of opportunity for Paul to just elbow the hell out of Chemo's head.
Especially with the way the rules were back then.
The back of the head especially, and his spine. These are things you're not allowed to do now, and you probably shouldn't do to anyone unless you're defending yourself.
Yeah.
But these are things that he had the option to do, but he just didn't.
Oh, by the way, one more note, pre-fight note about Paul. Apparently, no one will train him. As he was walking in the octagon, commentary noted that He's been going around the MMA world. They didn't call it the MMA world, but you get the point. He was going around, and nobody would help him out. He was too big, and nobody wanted to help him unlock that potential.
To be fair, it's like, well, trying to train a polar bear.
Very true.
Yeah, no one wants to train that.
No one wants to train that and then perhaps fight that down the line.
Yeah.
So out of this grappling exchange, Paul would end up on top of Chemo, where he really didn't get too many effective strikes going. I mean, I don't want to say he didn't land anything on Chemo, because there was some damage there. I thought Chemo actually had a pretty serious cut around his eye from some of those strikes, but at no point did it seem like, Big John was going to have to step in and pull Paul off of Chemo.
No. Unfortunately, Chemo just has a lot of endurance, it seems, even though he lost a lot of weight. While Paul, he's strong, but his gas tank is small. He's too big for his own good.
He either needs to improve that cardio and lean out like Chemo, or improve his technique.
Yeah.
And his attire, he may want to reconsider as well, because it sort of led to his downfall at the end of the fight. Do you want to break down how Chemo would eventually chop down the giant?
Advertisements would be his downfall, is a good way to put it. Paul went in wearing a shirt of some company.
I think it was his own proprietary polar bear shirt.
It could be. And underneath he had his leotard. He should have just gone in with a custom leotard, because that shirt ended up getting bunched around his neck and choking him out.
Yeah, Chemo from the bottom used Paul's own shirt to choke him, and also got a couple strikes in through there while he was choking him.
Yeah.
Eventually reversed the position to where he was on like a mount, but Paul's back was not flat against the floor. It was up against the side of the cage, so he was like a sideways mount. And from that position, he didn't even hold on to the cage. Chemo just braced up against the floor and reined in probably like 10 or like 12 shots before the corner threw in the towel.
Yeah, something like that.
And the first time we've seen the corner throw in a towel in a while.
Yeah. So even despite his not coming in with a cross on his back, he still did pretty well.
Still had the power of the Lord to carry him through his encounter with the polar bear and on to the second round of UFC 11.5.
Actually, I do say that he didn't have the cross on his back, but he does.
He does literally have a cross on his back.
Yeah.
In terms of a tattoo.
I feel like that might be blasphemous.
Yeah, it is kind of like, it doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to poke holes in the logic of a lot of hardcore Christians, especially those who tattoo religious iconography on them, because tattoos are against, it's like they're specifically outlawed in the Bible, if I'm not mistaken.
They are?
I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to have tattoos if you're orthodoxly religious. But we digress. We'll save that for the theology podcast.
Yeah, whenever that comes out.
So here we have an updated bracket for the tournament. Ken, unable to continue after breaking his hand. The alternate, Steve Nellmark, who won his alternate bout in less than 2 minutes, would advance to take on Tank Abbott. This bracket you see here would not necessarily be the bracket that actually carried through to the end of the night, but as we go on, we make it up.
Yep.
So Steve Nellmark and Tank Abbott squared off, and this fight lasted for less than a minute and a half. There was some wild punches to begin with. Tank framed Steve up against the cage, and after a little bit of scrambling, they would advance to the other side of the cage where Tank would frame him up against the fence, and then...
historic collapse.
Yeah, so watching it in real time, it was probably one of the most brutal knockouts we've seen.
Oh, easily.
The most brutal since the crucifix knockout from Gary.
That was just violent.
We got to see the replay of this one. This one wasn't so bad that they refused to show us it again. But the way Steve collapsed, as you can see here, not exactly great for your body, for your neck, for your leg, for your manhood, for your pride.
Getting knocked out in general isn't healthy for you, but collapsing in such a way is also not healthy for you.
Especially when, And allow me to read from... Matt, I'll have you read the section entitled Nell Marking from our friend Steve's Wikipedia here.
Steve Nellmark is perhaps most well known for his spectacular knockout loss to David Abbott, Tank Abbott. In it, he was crumpled underneath the cage, his legs bent under him, prompting audience members to shout, "He dead!" Since then, the act of getting knocked out in similar spectacular fashion, with the key components of the legs being tucked underneath and the slump over the cage, has been called
Nell Marking. Dude, he got knocked out so brutally, they came up with a new fucking word for it. That's rough, dude. That's pretty rough.
I mean, he left his mark.
I'll leave it at that for our friend Steve.
Yeah. Poor guy.
By the way, I should have mentioned this earlier. The fight started off with a power slam from Tank. He picked him up and he just dumped him on his head. So had he been knocked out from that power slam, perhaps could have avoided a legacy of shame. So what we have to talk about next for you is perhaps one of my least favorite things I've seen in especially these early UFCs. Very weird, very uncomfortable interview between Bruce Beck and Scott Ferrozzo. Do you want to just break down the vibe of this interaction for us before we get into the weird specifics?
Weirdly hostile to specifically, what's his name?
Bruce.
Specifically to Bruce. Bruce is just allowing Scott to talk, but he's getting very pushy. He's getting agitated at him.
He's kind of acting like he's cutting a pro wrestling style promo, which, normally I'm fine with, but our friend Scott takes it a bridge too far when he kind of shoves Bruce.
Yeah.
And things from that point are just really uncomfortable, and Bruce ends the interview with, "Don't shove me again."
Yeah. He's like, "Don't push me, Scott."
A very weird interview.
The whole time, Scott was just talking about how he should be in there fighting Tank, which, I mean, I can see why he thinks that, but he's not a big-ticket name yet.
He also has, one of the points Bruce was trying to make, and the reason I think Scott was getting upset, he was like, Scott, you have to prove yourself. You have to go through a tournament and show the people you're ready for a super fight. And Scott was trying to pull his WWE shtick and was like, "Nah, I'm the best. Fuck you. Give me my money. I want to fight." Kind of, thing. And came off as supremely douchey and unlikable.
He also, I guess, paid the card girls to say, "We love you, Scott," to the camera.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. It was... I hope they got paid a lot.
After this train wreck of an interview, we learned that our friend Chemo is out. Originally, I thought from an eye injury after getting hit in the eye several times by Paul while they were on the ground. Turns out withdrew because of dehydration.
Yeah. Not what I would really expect. I guess he just got really sweaty.
I mean, especially after slimming down, you'd think he'd have even better cardio.
Yeah.
And not that he has bad cardio, it was a grueling fight, but that's not what I expected to stop him from fighting Don. Up next, we have Don Frye taking on the alternate Mark Hall. We've seen Mark before. We've actually seen Don and Mark before. Don and Mark fought at UFC 10. This was the fight where Don unloaded on Mark's midsection and turned him into a side of beef.
Yeah.
So, Mark knows he's not the favorite in this matchup.
No.
And this matchup lasted for about as long as it takes you to flush a toilet. Less than a minute. Don yanked Mark into, they said, an Achilles hold on Wikipedia. And things ended very quickly.
Mark went in with no gloves. He got taken down, and I put it as knee bar in my notes, but I guess it was the
Achilles hold, knee bar, heel hook. Now, the thing is, none of that apparently fucking matters based off of some information we learned after the fights.
Yeah.
So let me read you this entry from Wikipedia. It's rather lengthy, but rather important, so stay with me. Mark Hall, who Frye defeated in the semifinals, would later claim that Don Frye and manager Rob DiParisia came into his dressing room during the tournament and convinced him to throw the two fighters' upcoming semifinal match. Hall says that since Tank Abbott had already advanced to the final and therefore probably wasn't, and after two relatively easy wins, Frye, who'd logged 11 minutes of cage time already that night, wanted to save his energy for the championship match because he'd already suffered two defeats to Frye earlier in his career and therefore probably wasn't going to win anyway. And DiParisia, by the way, apparently they had the same manager, implied that saying no would have a disastrous impact on his future.
Yeah.
They threatened him. Hall says he reluctantly agreed to go along with the ploy. Frye won by Achilles lock submission in 27 seconds. Referee Big John later wrote in his autobiography, "Let's Get It On." That's a great name for an autobiography, by the way. You can read Big John's words for us here.
Unfortunately, this night was the second time I felt I was refereeing a fixed bout. In the semifinals, Don Frye and Mark Hall met in a rematch of their UFC 10 bout. In their first encounter, Frye had beaten the piss out of Hall, who refused to give up. Here, though, Frye ankle-locked Hall to advance to the finals without breaking a sweat. The fight struck me as odd. Frye, a bread-and-butter wrestler and swing-to-the-fences puncher, had never won a fight by leg lock. I guess ever.
Yeah.
And Hall practically fell into the submission. I knew both fighters were managed by the same guy. And it wasn't 27 seconds, it was just 20 seconds.
So, a fight that will go down in infamy.
Yeah.
I'm surprised I hadn't heard about this before.
Yeah.
I remember hearing about, in a prior podcast, we talked about Oleg Tiktarov being in a dubious fight. But it turns out one of our boys, Don here, not only was he in a fight that was fixed, it may have been his idea, in fact.
Yeah.
So, feels bad, man.
I don't like that this is a thing, but I guess I can see how this easily happens with such a new sport.
Especially when both guys have the same manager.
Yeah. I wonder how Dan Severn felt about this. I like Dan Severn a lot, so I'm wondering what his input would be on this.
Dan wasn't there in person, but we would, after this semifinal bout, cut to a long-form interview between Jeff Blatnick and Dan Severn that I'm not sure if it was shot earlier at this event or if it was shot before another event, but the shot was of them in the broadcast, or in some booth, in front of an empty arena with the UFC banners hanging, and they talked about Dan's Olympic days. Of course, Dan and Jeff were in the Olympics together. They reminisced for quite some time. This segment was like 10 or 20 minutes. It went for a while.
Dan's an impressive man. He's got a long record of success, and I'm glad to see, even with him being this big muscle man, he's got a very soft-spoken voice.
He sounds like a nice farm boy, and I can't wait to see him fight again.
Yeah.
Up next, we have the final of the night. Tank Abbott taking on Don Frye in a rematch. Because if you'll remember, Don already beat the brakes off of Tank once in the past. This time fighting for $150,000. And the fight started off with a brawl.
Mm-hmm. It actually started with Don getting... I think he got rocked.
Yeah, they both threw out some pretty hard shots. And Tank, being the bigger guy, cracked Don pretty hard.
Yeah. They swung back and forth, but I think Don was just a little more aggressive, so Tank started backing up. He tripped over and fell.
From that point, our friend Tank was more or less fucked, in so many words. After the brief exchange on the feet and Tank tripping, Don would take his back, get some shots in from the back. Again, I don't think a lot of these guys realize what they could really do from that position. He could have thrown elbows to the back of the head. He could have punched him in the back of the head. Chose to be slightly more honorable and immediately went for a rear naked choke. Tank was actually able to get out of the first attempt, but after escaping that first choke, Tank was strangled by Don. And this, I gotta say, this is a great shot. The blood seeping from in between Don's eyes as he squeezes the life out of Tank Abbott.
Yeah.
As short as it was, I think me and Matt concur that this was our fight of the night.
I liked it because it was just so action-packed real quick.
And of course, the stakes help.
Yeah. Part of the stakes being that the fighter who won this was supposed to go on to fight Dan, Dan Severn. And I was in a huge hope for Don and Dan to fight, because they're like, they're on the same team, and
they're friends.
Yeah, and Don is kind of like the mini boss to Dan.
However, we would find out on Wikipedia, not in this event, because they marketed after this that we would see Don and Dan square off. But according to our trusty friends of Wikipedia, this event will be the last time, Don Frye fought in the UFC, as he would also transition into pro wrestling along with Ken Shamrock, signing with New Japan Pro Wrestling. So our friend Don, gone from the UFC.
I'm so sad.
I will say, though, we do see Don Frye again in Pride. So this is not the last you and I will see on this podcast of Don Frye.
I need that fight, though.
Honestly, if you want my take on it, and this isn't me having read anything or being sure of anything, but I think maybe one of the reasons this was the last time we saw Don was because he refused to fight Dan, because they're friends. And he didn't want to fight him. But that's just speculation for me. If you know, please leave a comment.
Yeah. I guess this is just me thinking. Don dropping out once he's got the top of the game, pretty much on par with Dan. They're friends. They're the winners of this sport right now.
And also, the money they're making, while it isn't nothing, it's not enough to ruin lifelong friendships over.
Yeah.
I'm sure they both valued their partnership more than one payday they'd have by squaring off.
If I had to put my bets, I'd put my bets on Dan, though, just because he's the bigger guy.
I probably would as well. Although, if Don caught him on his way in, we'd have to see how Dan's chin would hold up.
Yeah. One thing I just realized, though, is we've never seen Dan use gloves. So, would he wear gloves? Don wears gloves.
Perhaps. I mean, next time we see Dan, maybe he'll be wearing gloves.
Maybe he's going to adopt the garb of the sport. So, after this last fight, we had this little interview with Tank just to get the crowd favorite opinion, and there wasn't a whole lot of substance to it other than at the end they asked him if he really doesn't respect anyone, and he said, no, I don't respect anyone. It's like, do you respect me? It's like, not even you.
So the poor interviewer, man, the poor budget Joe Rogan.
Tank, you're
never change.
Yeah,
never change, Tank. That's gonna do it for us here today on MMA Start to Finish. Please be sure to click the like button if you're listening on YouTube. Leave a comment. If you're listening on other platforms, be sure to rate us and like on there. And up next on MMA Start to Finish, we will see UFC 12 Judgment Day. And it seems like we have here Dan Severn and Mark Coleman squaring off. So, Don's out, Mark's in. It's time for the two big beefy men to battle. So, until then, thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you later.
Adios.